Thank you everyone for being here and welcome to our third talk on Orthodox Evangelism. If you were here for the first two talks or if you listened to them online or watched them online, you know that those are the foundation for everything that follows. So there will be a lot of references back to those first two lectures. If you haven't watched them, I recommend doing so. Those are the ones that didn't specifically talk about talking to a particular group of people, but rather talked about our disposition and how we engage in talking about the faith. So talk one talked about the different types of evangelism. We talked about three different types of evangelism and what our goals are in evangelism. And we talked about this kind of funny statement I made that our goal is not to convince people, and that might have been surprising, but I explained what I meant by that. And talk two was largely about our disposition when we talk about the faith, and it gave some foundational tools to use. And the main tool that we talked about was the Socratic Method. The Socratic Method is where you discover the underlying presuppositions behind what someone is saying, and you start to kind of help them explore those presuppositions. Those presuppositions are things that we don't typically think much about. And so it's a good thing to do when you're talking with somebody to kind of help them explore the things that they just assume are true, but it may not be true, or maybe a little bit different than how they particularly view them. So first, on this third talk, as we talk about talking with atheists and orthodoxy and atheists, I want to talk first about my interest in this topic and why I chose to do this one first. And my interest grew when in my college years I began becoming interested in Christian and atheist debates. Not typically Orthodox, usually evangelical. But I discovered that there is a whole series of debates from the 90s between Protestants, typically, sometimes Catholics, but Christians of some sort and atheists. And I got excited about those and started watching them again and again and again. But as I watched these, I became more and more disenchanted with the whole debate idea, and I really became kind of disappointed with the Christians in these debates. I often watched as the atheists brought up objections that really resonated with me. They didn't make me question a belief in God, but there was something a little bit deeper happening here. And what was happening? Why is it that I was watching these things and I kind of questioned the Christian approach but agreed more with the atheist approach? I think there were four things going on. First is, the Christians often presented a vision for God that I found extremely dry and impersonal. And sometimes it went the other way. It was overly emotional and overly subjective, but mainly it was dry and impersonal, such that they left me with a vision for a God that I really didn't have a desire to grow closer to. It was a God who I thought had good arguments in his favor, but was it a God that I wanted to have a relationship with? Not really. And so they presented a God that I really didn't recognize, and they were defending a God that I didn't really recognize and didn't really know myself. Second, often the Christians would give points about God, and they would describe things about God, but at the end, there was really no sense of knowing God on an intimate basis. Everything was so over-rationalized. Now, of course, that's not really the goal of a debate. When you're debating, you want to talk about God because you're talking to the whole audience. You can't really talk about a personal relationship with God and help people to know God intimately. But I still found that this kind of distorted the Christian message. Many people would say a lot of right things about God. They were correct what they said about God, but it still left the listeners with that first problem that I talked about. It was a false view of who God really was. And I walked away kind of going, if this is Christianity, do I really want to be Christian? Is this really the God that I want to get to know? Third, while many of the Christians' arguments and counter-arguments were very good, they still met atheist arguments from where they were given. In other words, they rarely did the Socratic Method. They rarely challenged the premises upon which many of the atheist arguments were made. So what I mean by that is, let me give you this example. Many atheists would bring up what is commonly called the problem of evil or the problem of suffering. I'm sure you've come across this at some point. The Christian can and should, and we'll talk about this later, provide an explanation for why suffering and evil exists in the world and how these do not in any way injure a belief in God. We should be able to do that. However, it always bothered me that the Christians never went a step further. And in going a step further, what would we say? Well, as an Orthodox Christian, I would explain that the problem is not a problem of evil and suffering. We are people who constantly disobey God. We disobey his commands. He gave us everything good that we have, and we constantly turn away from him. And so one would expect suffering. One would expect to not live a very happy life because we're constantly turning away from the source of goodness. And so what are we Christians surprised by? We're not surprised that evil and suffering exist in the world. We're surprised that goodness, joy, peace, and mercy exist in the world at all. In other words, from the Christian standpoint, there is no problem of evil. It's a false premise. The presupposition is that the existence of suffering and evil should not be the case. But from the Christian perspective, because we constantly sin and constantly spit in the face of God, suffering and evil are no surprise. What is a surprise is that God continues to be merciful and grant good things to us. So rather than there being a problem of evil, it's a problem of goodness. It's a problem of blessings. Why is there anything good in the world when all we do is spurn God? And this problem reveals the shocking, in a good way, condescension and loving nature of God. That reveals more of God's nature than anything. I can explain logically why evil and suffering exists, which is what most of the Christians would do. But no one ever explained that actually the existence of goodness is the real surprise for us, and that shows just what a loving God we actually have. In other words, you get into this debate about the existence of evil and suffering in the world, and my response is that actually reveals how good our God is, not the idea that God doesn't exist at all. And I wish the Christians would have gone in that direction. Finally, the fourth reason I didn't really always love these debates, the Christian debaters sometimes, and definitely not always, some of them were very good. Some were very good. But many times, forgive me, the personalities that were debating took away from their arguments. And so I saw Christians who came off as very arrogant and smug, and that very much detracted from presenting a strong Christian case. What I came to realize was a holy figure sitting in silence is often a much better witness for the power of our faith than the best arguments in the world spouted from an arrogant mouth. So we have to know who's giving the arguments, and they have to be a good example of what they're preaching. I'm not saying that I am or that we are necessarily, but it does show that we need to be working on our own humility and love and mercy before we engage with somebody. We talked about that in the first couple lectures. If you're going to go in hot and angry, you're so dumb for not believing in my God of mercy. Well, wait a minute. Is this a good example? Have you revealed anything of the goodness of God? No, of course not. Of course not. Whereas if you go in with a lot of humility and peace, it may reveal something really beautiful. So for these reasons and more, these debates typically aren't very convincing to me. They get people more entrenched in their viewpoints because people typically aren't very open to opposing viewpoints in the first place. And so really what was happening was that people would watch these debates and the Christians in the audience would say, yep, the Christian clearly won. And the atheists in the audience would say, well, the atheist clearly won. And nobody really changed anything either way. Now, I'm not saying that the debates were completely worthless. I don't think they were worthless. God forbid we have atheist arguments for which we do not have strong and public rebuttals. We need those. In that sense, the debates were helpful because at least for the Christians, they showed we did have a strong case. And in fact, that case was so strong, it shocked the atheists in the 90s. I don't know if you're aware of this, but this idea of like public university debates between a Christian and an atheist, they weren't happening in the 60s, 70s, 80s very much, but in the 90s they started to happen. And you know what happened? The atheists, who were usually really, they had delved deeply into some sort of science, biology, or physics, or whatever it was, they didn't prep. Because they thought, well, these Christians are just country bumpkins. They don't know a thing. So I don't really need to prepare anything. And they'd go and make their arguments, and then for every point that they made, the Christians would have, from a scientific viewpoint, a counter-argument. And these atheists began being embarrassed again and again and again until a couple years into this, they said, we need to bone up. We need to start actually doing a little bit more research into their arguments and have better counter-arguments. They actually were failing in this. So there is a place for this. But of course, the idea of a Christian versus atheist debate is not our goal. That's not what evangelism is. They can be helpful. They can be helpful in learning some different ideas and rebuttals and learning about the science. They can be helpful in that sense, but that's not really what we're doing anyway. So anyway, as I got into these debates and started watching them more and more, I started to contemplate more and more, how could a faithful and humble Orthodox Christian act and effectively talk to atheists? How would an Orthodox Christian, what would they say in a debate that would be different? That's one of the reasons I liked watching them, was, the usually evangelical had answered this way, how would I answer? But more importantly, in a one-on-one discussion, how should we talk to the atheist? And so this is what we're talking about today. It's important, however, to first explain what this talk is not. What is this talk not? So recall in the first two lectures that we discussed Orthodox evangelism as not being about arguing or even trying to convince people. Our goals are simply to leave the other person with, what was that line from St. Paisios? Anybody remember? A holy sense of discomfort. And to invite them a bit into the Orthodox worldview so that we plant a seed. And that seed, hopefully, eventually, will be something that will eventually sprout and the person can then explore. We want to leave them with an opening to exploring the beauty and mystery of Christ and the Orthodox Christian faith. So what are we not doing? This talk is not about giving a point-by-point refutation of their arguments. If that's what you were hoping for tonight, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm going to disappoint you right now. I'm not going to go through that. I'm not going to go through a point-by-point refutation of materialistic evolution. I'm not going to go through a point-by-point refutation of some of their biological arguments, some of the physics arguments, some of the philosophical arguments. We will do a little bit of that with the talking about the presuppositions. But really, if you want to learn about that, there's many, many good books you can turn to. Okay, I want to offer just a few suggestions. I've read a lot of these books, combating atheist arguments, and I've read a lot of the atheist books as well. Some of those are laughably bad, like really, really bad, and yet they become very popular because people don't read the counter-arguments. They think they're strong arguments. But on the Christian side, there's a few that I would recommend. The first is called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. It's by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek. It's a very, very good book. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. They're two, if I remember right, they're two evangelicals, and they go through a lot of the cosmological and other arguments that atheists typically bring up, and they show that actually to be an atheist, it takes a lot more faith than it does to be a Christian, and they do a good job of that. The other one I would recommend is a very different book. It's called The Godless Delusion by Patrick Madrid and Kenneth Hensley. And in this book, it goes through a lot of what we'll talk about at the end of today's lecture, a lot of the presuppositions that go into atheist arguments. They do a really, I'm going to scan over these things really quickly tonight. They spend many, many pages explaining the philosophical problems behind the atheist arguments. There's also a book that I think Orthodox Christians should read, and it's called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. This is a really good book that explains how strong the Christian foundation of the Bible is and the belief in the resurrection from a historical critical standpoint. It's very, very good, The Case for Christ. Lee Strobel wrote a lot of follow-ups, the Case for Faith, which I didn't like at all, and some others. I wouldn't recommend a lot of his other stuff, but The Case for Christ I do recommend. And then for a philosophical response to atheism, from an Orthodox Christian, there's a book called Atheist Delusions by David Bentley Hart. Now, if you know about David Bentley Hart, you can kind of know what you're in for here. Very well written, very snarky. Very, very snarky. It's kind of the way he writes. But I will say, I've read just about half of it now, and it's very, very good in talking about the philosophical basis for atheism. He responds very well. There's also many debates, like I said, on YouTube. Some are better than others, but I would really say that the books are more helpful if you want to learn how to counter a lot of the arguments from atheism. But if these are not what we're doing, what is our positive goal? What are we actually trying to do tonight? Again, to repeat from my previous talk, we want to give a holy sense of discomfort and to present a vision, a good, true vision of our loving and merciful God. That's really what we want to do when we talk with atheists. And this means that your focus should be more on the person with whom you are speaking than the arguments they give. This is why those first 2 lectures were so important. They address our approach to people rather than specifically to arguments and worldviews. And the principles set forth in the first 2 lectures are universal for all the lectures that we're going to give from here on out. We must remember that we are talking with a person who, even if they're fighting against God, is still made in the image of God. When we merely respond to arguments, we're really debating for an audience, which again, there may be a time and a place for that. But that's not what you're going to be doing. You'll be talking with an atheist, typically one-on-one. So you have to ask these questions. Who is this person with whom I'm speaking? Who do they think the Christian God is? What do they think when they hear the word religion? What happens inside of them emotionally when they hear the word religion? What has been their personal experience with religion in the past? And I want to give a little focus to a few of these questions. That last one is really important. What has been their personal experience with religion in the past? Do you know what the most common factor I found when talking with atheists is? The most common thing that comes up? When you really get down to talking to them as persons, you find that most of the hardened atheists have had past traumas or bad experiences with religion or religious people in their past. Most of them have had bad experiences in the past. There's no argument, there's no logical proof that is going to cut through walls built of emotional traumas. You are never going to argue somebody out of an emotional trauma. It's not going to happen. Thus, what do they really need? Understanding and compassion for that trauma first. They have to be heard first. You have to get to know them, get to know what happened to them, and meet them where they are, first and foremost. Faith cannot be viewed as a continued threat to them if they're ever going to consider it in the first place. And as long as they view faith and religion as a threat, do you think they're going to listen to any argument you give? No way. And that's where you're going to see emotions spike and a lot of yelling and a lot of screaming and no minds changed. That's what's going to happen. So this aspect of our approach to deal with the person rather than the arguments is the most essential thing to remember and to enact. If you remember nothing else of the arguments from tonight, if you remember that, there's a good chance you're going to get through to that person way more than you realized you would have with all the knowledge in the world, which again is why I think a lot of these debates are not all that helpful. A lot of times I wanted to take the atheist off the stage and sit him in a room and say, what happened to you when you were younger? You can't really do that on a stage, but you can tell. You can tell something, there's something inside of them, and you can tell it from that visceral reaction. There's something that happened to you. I know it's like psychoanalyzing, but the first question I want to ask most of the men is, tell me about your relationship with your father. It's true. It's true, because honestly, our image for God usually comes from our image from our parents. Whether you like it or not, this is the reality, is that the way that if our parents were really tough on us, really demanding and not very merciful, guess how you begin to see God? Tough, demanding, and not very merciful. So once you can see this person as an actual person and deal with them with some compassion first, you may actually open some doors that will otherwise remain solidly locked shut, that you'll never get through with good argumentation. So this means that we have to understand both their experiences of faith and their personal understanding of God, whether that understanding is one that they once held or it's an understanding that they believe you hold. So a lot of people, even who maybe they didn't have a traumatic experience growing up with religion, they still had a faith when they were younger that taught them a very false view of God. And they view God in those terms. And so when they hear you say God, they immediately think of those things. For instance, one of the very common ones today is the vending machine God who is interested in moral exchanges. So how do you put money into the vending machine to get what you want out of God? You be a good person and go do good things. And if you do good things will happen to you. If you do bad things will happen to you. And then they come out into the real world. The world doesn't work that way. And they say, well, I struggled for years to do all the right thing and to be a good person, and God has made a mess of my life and everything's fallen apart. Well, you need to break through that false vision of God before you can ever open them up to orthodoxy. And they need to hear what God is actually like and what's really happening here. So this is the initial part of the encounter, getting to know the person and what their views on God actually are. And in doing this, you're going to be asking a lot of questions and doing very little talking. And that's part of the really tough part of good evangelism, is you have to start off by being very patient and really humbling yourself. Because there's going to be a lot of times where you're going to want to correct them on certain views and certain things they say. You have to avoid that. Avoid correcting misperceptions about God right away. There will be a time for this, but the person needs to feel heard first. And if you cut them off every time they say something wrong, it's not going to happen. Also, during this period, as you go through this process, don't become offended. Be cautious about becoming really offended, especially when someone was wounded. Their hurt usually comes out as bitterness, and they want to get revenge. And they get a thrill out of offending you and saying scandalous things, saying blasphemous things. There's a time to respond to that, but if they're actually opening up in this process, now's not the time. Let them get out their rage. Let them see you humbly take it and just be quiet and patiently go through their abuse. In this process, you'll be able to gauge something we previously discussed, and that's whether having this conversation will be beneficial in the first place. A person who's clearly not open to really listening to you initially may become open as they start feeling safe with you. But if they continue to be confrontational, snarky, rude, closed off, you might as well just walk away. And that's when you do it. That's the time to say, you know what? I've been very respectful towards you. I haven't challenged you or shut you down, and all you do is intentionally try to offend me left and right. I'm walking away from this. When you're ready to have a real conversation and be an adult, we can talk. So then the question becomes, well, what happens if the person is willing to hear you out? What do you do next? Well, first, if any trauma has been experienced from them, that has to be empathized with first. You have to do that work first. Then you can gently begin the Socratic Method here. And this means probing some of the presuppositions and misconceptions that have been expressed so far. So you might say something like, you know, you presented a view of God that's so different than what my faith and my experience has taught me. And then you can ask a question. Could I ask about, or could we talk about your assertion that blah, 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 blah. See, once the person has been actually treated like a real human being and they've been empathized with, they may actually be open to the idea that their particular ideas of God may not be right on. This is an opportunity to say, okay, what if there's a better vision for this? What if there's a better option out there? Can I tell you what my faith teaches me about God and my relationship with God, and how that actually avoids some of the problems you've experienced? They'll actually be open to that, hopefully. Now, depending on who you're talking to, the topic that you then touch on will vary wildly. There are many, many different topics you can talk about. Obviously, we can't go through all of them. It's impossible. That's where those books may be helpful. But what I want to do here is discuss a few of the common areas of presuppositions that come up and how we can learn to kind of question them and get people thinking about them in a different way. Okay? Everything I've said so far, does it make sense? We okay with it so far? Okay, good. All right. So, the first area is one that I've already mentioned. It's the area of the problem of evil. This is a very, very common objection. It usually sounds like this. If God is all good and all powerful, then evil and suffering would not exist in the world. Evil and suffering do exist in the world, so either God is not all good or he is not all powerful, or there's just really no God at all. Okay? Have we heard this one before? Yes. Okay. Here's the common Christian response. I'm taking a very, very long response. I'm going to truncate it down to just a simple paragraph because we don't have time to go through this whole thing. But this is the common Christian response. God, out of his love for mankind, created man to have free will. For God to intervene in every case of man freely engaging in evil and causing others to suffer, God would have to remove man's free will and essentially make him a robot. Man would no longer be man. Further, because man was made as the pinnacle of creation, as man fell away from God and became distorted, so did the world around him. And thus natural disasters occur in the world because man is out of communion with God and man sins. And this is what caused the world to have suffering and evil in it. They're not actually created by God. They're not supposed to be there, but as long as man continues to separate himself from God, then the natural results of separating ourselves from God will exist. Those are suffering and evil. Okay? Now, are those true statements? Yes, those are true statements. They're absolutely fair arguments to make in response to this suggestion. And we could, again, give a much fuller and deeper explanation of these points. But having said that, do you think the other person's going to be all that convinced in the first place? Probably not. They're probably pretty entrenched in their beliefs. And so what you have to do is engage in the Socratic method and look at the underlying presuppositions of that statement. So this is a better tactic, I think, and this is more effective. I actually did see this happen in a debate where the atheist had no answer to it, and so he kept bringing up the same arguments again and again, and the Christian kept saying, yes, but you never answered my questions of, and what we're going to go over. And at the end of it, the atheist just looked like he was lost and had no idea what to do, and he didn't. He didn't know what to do. So here's the statement again. An all-good and all-powerful God wouldn't allow evil and suffering to exist in the world. What is the underlying presupposition in this argument? Can anybody pick it out? What's the underlying presupposition? An all-good and all-powerful God wouldn't allow evil and suffering to exist in this world. The underlying presupposition is that when someone says this, they believe there is a purely objective definition for good and evil. Objective here means not subjective, and that means not reliant on any personal opinion and existing in reality outside of the human mind. Okay? So outside, just in a purely materialistic world, there is an objective definition for good and evil out there. And we should all know what that is. Well, if man is really just the result of accidents in nature, and we're nothing more than just simply intelligent but purely material beings, where does objective good and evil come from? Where does it come from? Does it come just from nature? Where does our concept of them originate from? Do we see ideas of good and evil existing in nature all around us? Have you ever watched Discovery Channel? No. No, of course not. There is no objective understanding of good and evil when you see the world around you outside of mankind. By referencing good and evil, then, the atheist assumes that something like objective morality actually exists in the first place, but he cannot account for its existence in the first place. He can't account for them. You can't complain about evil that exists in the world if you cannot give me an objective definition for what the term evil is. So here's the common response. Well, I don't need some God up in the sky to tell me not to murder someone. You ever heard that one before? That one comes up all the time. There's actually 5 responses that I could give to this. Number 1, if all there is the natural material world, then is mere intelligence what leads you to that belief? Because it certainly doesn't exist in the animal kingdom. You may not need a God to tell you not to murder someone, but tigers don't need that. And so what makes us different? Does morality just come with intelligence? Do we equate intelligence with morality? If we do, that leads to a whole host of other problems. The second objection is you assume in this statement that murder is wrong, but you avoided giving an answer to where that supposedly objective truth comes from. Again, it doesn't exist in the animal kingdom, so why does it exist with man? You need to tell me objectively where it says that murder is wrong. Not subjectively, objectively, where we can find that principle embedded in man from nature. Third, isn't it interesting that you assume murder to be wrong without being able to give an objective source for that truth? It's as if there's some sense of morality inborn in mankind. You have to be able to explain that from a material perspective. I can explain that as a Christian. I can say that God created man in his image and likeness. And because of that, we have an inborn understanding that murder is wrong. Again, the rest of the material world doesn't seem to have that. Why is it that mankind does? I can explain it. Can you do that from a materialistic point of view? By the way, I'm saying these with a little bit of oomph. This is not the way you would actually say it in a one-on-one conversation. But fourth, you state something that countless people throughout history have not agreed with. There have been many murderers, both of individuals and mass murderers, who believed themselves to be morally justified in their actions. Can you tell me objectively why they, with the same materialistic evolution that you have, didn't understand the objective idea that murder was wrong and you do? What went wrong in their development? And fifth, and finally, Isn't it interesting that people always use the extreme case of things like murder for this argument? I don't need a God to tell me not to murder someone. And yet, aren't there like thousands upon thousands of morally gray areas in which our culture is in constant disagreement? And wouldn't it be nice to have an authority that created us to tell us how to sift through these things? So you can use that one example, but when we go to other moral examples, yeah, you do need a God to tell you that certain things are good and certain things are bad. So our task when this argument arises is to question the basis on which the atheist believes that good and evil exists in the first place. Without God, these things are purely subjective. They're personal and they're relative. And they can change from person to person, from culture to culture, and from situation to situation. But to be morally outraged at the actions or inactions of God, when you believe yourself to have been formed by nothing but stardust, left to itself for millions or billions of years, is a great contradiction. This is what they don't realize. When an atheist comes along and says, I don't need a God to tell me that murder is wrong, but I've heard about the God of the Old Testament, and what he did was morally wrong. And you go, yeah, but you believe that a bunch of particles collided and that over billions of years things developed, and now you have a moral outrage, but you have no explanation for where that moral outrage against God comes from. There's a deep contradiction happening within them at that very moment that has to be examined. So, again, in that book by Patrick Madrid and I forget the other name, but the Godless Delusion, they go into a much longer explanation of this that I think is really helpful. That's why I would recommend that book. In fact, they go through a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay, so that's the first one. The idea of the existence of good and evil. You cannot explain for that outside of some objective reality of it, and a creator would explain that, where the material creation of the world from nothing does not explain the existence of good and evil from an objective standpoint. The second area to question, the idea that we are nothing but material beings. So frequently, the atheist will reject not only the existence of God, but the very idea that there's a human soul or anything invisible. They'll say, we are nothing but a collection of material substances and reactions. This is just material in the world that has been over, again, the course of millions or maybe billions of years, has formed and evolved, and that's all we are. What this assertion does, though, is destroy its own validity. Why? What do I mean by this? Well, if we're nothing but the chemical reactions of our brains working in and through purely material bodies, then everything I think, do, and say is the reaction of those same chemical reactions. And that means that the very sentence that we're nothing but a collection of material substances and reactions is itself just the reaction of chemical reactions in our brain causing us to say that. So why trust in the first place? In fact, it's just chemical reactions in your brain, and it's a purely materialist existence that caused you to get up and go into your cars and drive here and sit down and listen to this. And everything that I'm saying right now is just the result of mindless chemical reactions and materials going around, and so I don't know why you would try to agree or disagree with anything I'm saying. I don't even know why I'm here right now. This is just the result of chemical reaction. Do you see how life becomes absurd? You can also see why the atheist would have no problem killing hundreds of thousands or millions of Orthodox Christians in the 20th century. This is just the results of material processes. Again, there's an absurdity of an atheist passionately explaining why a belief in God is foolish if their very speech, as well as the Christian who's debating them, is just the results of chemical reactions happening in the brain. You aren't really seeing an argument and debate happen then. You're just seeing the results of chemical reactions without any true freedom or choice, causing both sides to say and do as they are. So how absurd does this get? Well, if you pick up a book by an atheist full of profound knowledge trying to convince you that there is no God, you're picking up what is the result of chemical reactions happening in the brain which caused the author to write the book in the first place. And thus, there's no true knowledge. Knowledge is destroyed. Because how can you trust one statement over another when they're both just the results of chemical reactions? They're just material substance that happened to create this. In fact, your agreement or disagreement with those arguments is also nothing but material chemical reactions happening in your brain. You see how absurd this gets? You could ask the materialist atheist as he writes his book why he's writing, and he may say, because belief in God is a delusion, and I want people to know that. But the only consistent answer he could actually give is because the chemicals in my brain are making me do it. It's the only one. That's the only, if you have a purely materialistic worldview, that is the only consistent answer. And should we believe that answer? There's no should. Either the chemical reactions in your brain will cause you to believe it or they won't. If you're thinking through this, you're not really thinking through this. It's just the chemical. You can go through this again and again. So in other words, a purely materialistic worldview destroys choice, freedom, and knowledge. It also destroys human dignity. There's no objective material dignity. It destroys, as we talked about, the very concepts of morality, of good and evil. None of it is actually real. It's just chemical reactions. So why are you getting angry at my arguments for God? Oh yeah, your anger is just a chemical reaction. See, this is getting absurd. We just go in circles here. So this is our response to the claim. We are nothing but material beings. Well, then free will and knowledge don't really exist, and thus I can't trust the sentence you just spoke any more or less than I can trust my own reaction to it, because it's just all material reactions and chemical reactions. You see? So this is where philosophically, atheism falls flat. And I will tell you, I have seen again and again and again atheists try to respond to these things, and I've never found, again, it could just be chemical reactions, but I've never found convincing any of their particular arguments. And this brings us to the third area, which is already connected to this, and that's the idea of human consciousness. A purely materialistic world simply cannot explain the emergence and existence of consciousness. And there's even atheist scientists today that admit that the existence of consciousness remains a complete and utter mystery. We cannot explain. This, I think, by the way, is why the fathers of the church believed that an existence of God was inborn in us. The very fact that we're thinking about it suggests that there must be a God. Because without a God, there would be no consciousness to think of it in the first place. It would all just be material things. Material can't think. In a purely materialistic worldview, matter would have to produce consciousness. If you have a purely materialistic worldview, there is no spiritual side, there is no invisible world, there is no God, matter would have to create consciousness. Matter itself would have to become, through simple movement and reactions, self-aware. Can you think through that one? Matter would have to become self-aware. There's a philosopher named J.P. Moreland, and he has a great quote on this. He says, "Start with matter and tweak it physically, and all you will get is tweaked matter." You're not going to tweak it till it becomes self-aware. It just doesn't work that way. So the fact that the atheist with whom you are speaking is self-aware, conscious, as an individual with a personality and free choice is itself a point to be highlighted. They are themselves walking, talking, thinking self-contradictions of their worldview. That's just the reality of what you're dealing with. Now, notice in everything that I said, we could keep going with a lot of these presuppositions, but I think those three are good just to start with. Notice that none of the arguments there, none of the question of their presupposition is a positive argument for the existence of God. It's simply showing that atheism itself doesn't really work, which is why you have to have more faith to be an atheist than to be a Christian. But beyond this, I'm also not really going to talk about the proofs for God. If you're aware, there is a philosophical tradition, mainly within Catholicism, that talks about the philosophical proofs for God. These proofs, which you can readily find online, are not anything I've ever really been infatuated with. When I was at Gonzaga, a Catholic Jesuit university, we talked a lot about these things. They come mainly from Western scholastic traditions, but you can find some of them in some of the Eastern Fathers. I found them in St. Maximus the Confessor and St. John of Damascus. Mainly they talk about the idea of the unmoved mover. So the idea that there's movement in history, throughout all of human history. Movement comes from other movement. There has to be a reaction of some sort. And so where did the movement begin? There must have been an unmoved mover, a God at the beginning of that somewhere. And they do talk about these things, and I think those are legitimate. By the way, I do want to mention this. I told you that Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, I think is, maybe I didn't mention him. Well, I did now. I think it's worthless. So out of all, I have a lot of books by atheists, and I haven't read through all of them, but I've read a lot of them, and I find his to be pretty worthless in many ways. I don't find him to be a very He's not very understanding of Christianity in the first place. He doesn't know who he's arguing with or what he's arguing with, so he makes a lot of straw man arguments. And I'm not joking you. He was asked this. He was asked where man first came from. If we go all the way back, go through evolution, where did this movement and this creation of even electrons and atoms and everything, where did that start with? And do you know what his answer was? If you go way back, there's probably some really intelligent alien life form out there somewhere that created it. I'm not joking you. I'm not joking you. And I don't think he quite had the wisdom to sit there and go, wait a minute, they would have had to come from somewhere. That's what he thought, aliens. He's more okay with aliens than God. And he seems really bitter against God, so what does that tell you? He probably has some personal issues there that need to be addressed. Anyway, there are a couple Eastern Fathers, like I said, who have mentioned these proofs for God, but the difference is the Eastern Fathers note them as if in passing. They never really make them a specific area of study. You'll never find in like St. John Chrysostom like the book about the proofs for God. In the West, you found those a lot more. And I think this is for a couple reasons, one of which I mentioned. First, the Orthodox Fathers tend to take the existence of God as self-evident, both in nature and in ourselves. They say that this is born within us, that we know that God exists in some way or another. Second, the Orthodox Fathers understood that the most powerful proof of God comes from our encounter with him. And thus, they were far more focused on how we have that encounter. In other words, the ascetic life and the purity of the heart. Purifying the heart was something that interested them far more than logically showing the proof for God. The reality is that the proofs for the existence of God rarely have much effect on people. And the only cases that I've seen them really convince someone, there's two cases that I can think of. They ended up making the people intellectual believers in some sort of God out there somewhere. In other words, philosophically, they were at most deists. They believed there was some God out there somewhere, but it didn't really have a profound change in their lives or in their hearts. They didn't become deep believers when they encountered these proofs. I'm not saying that these proofs are all useless again. I think that there is some philosophical value in having these proofs for God, but I really don't find much use in relying upon them. And I've never talked with an atheist or watched a debate where they've seen a proof for God where it caused them to slow down and really think. Whereas again, if you do everything that we've just talked about, you really get to know them, you deal with their traumas, you explain to them where their view of God is broken and how you really view God, then you go to some of their presuppositions and say, these are the areas that I think, you're assuming these things that I think don't really work. And then you'll go to the last part, which we'll talk about in a second, which is really revealing the beauty of orthodoxy. That's way more effective than saying, well, Thomas Aquinas gave us 5 proofs for God, and this one, it's not really going to go anywhere. It's really not going to go anywhere. But there is one particular proof for God's existence that I actually find really, really helpful. And I find it helpful not because it itself is a one-stop encapsulated proof for God's existence that is the be-all and end-all. I find it helpful because it really gets people thinking. And again, that's part of what you're trying to do. You're trying to plant some seeds and to leave them with a holy sense of discomfort and get them thinking about these things a little bit more. So, what is the one that I find helpful? If we in the world around us are nothing but material things, then, by evolutionary standards, we should be satisfied with the material world around us. We are, however, constantly dissatisfied and somehow feeling empty with our merely material existence. The human heart seems to yearn for an eternal, infinite, and transcendent life of peace, beauty, joy, and love. Well, the material world simply cannot produce any infinite examples of any of these. So how could the existence of a heart that yearns for the infinite be explained by a purely materialistic evolutionary existence? Does that make sense? If our heart is yearning for the infinite, there's no material explanation that can explain that yearning in the first place. How could materialist evolution create a being that yearns for something that doesn't exist? I would say that it cannot and would not. There seems to be something divine within man, a divine spark that yearns for eternal life in the fullest sense of the word. Not just word, not just eternal existence, but full life. Life of infinite joy, peace, love, beauty. There's something within man that's already there. And I would say that even atheists seem to understand this. They can recognize that in themselves, that they're constantly dissatisfied. If they weren't dissatisfied, by the way, why would they get emotional about their arguments in the first place? What would it matter if the guy next to you believes in God? You can go on living your life without it. Now, you can sit there and explain, well, religion has created so many wars. So has atheism. Religion's made people miserable. So is atheism. You're not going to win that battle. And by the way, a lot of the arguments in that sense are really false. Have you ever heard that religion was the cause of like 90-something% of wars? That it's not even close to being true. It's not even close. David Bentley Hart does a good job in his Atheist Delusions of explaining a little bit of this and just how philosophically that's already broken. But it's just not the case. It's just not the case, and it's not a very sophisticated argument on many levels. You know, one of the things he mentions in there is that you can find any religion or any philosophy or any political group in which there are bad actors and people who act against the principles that they're being taught. Do you always throw away everything? You know, have you ever found somebody who believes maybe like a beatnik who believes in pure peace all the time? Have you ever seen him lose his temper and punch somebody? Well, I guess then the whole philosophy is just throw it out. It doesn't exist. It can't be real. Well, so you can find people who claim to be religious who act in ways contrary to their faith because people are complex. It's one of the things he mentions. But either way, if you look at the real statistics, it's not even close to being true. The reality is this: the statement that things aren't the way they're supposed to be, which is something I've literally heard an atheist say this, the world just doesn't seem to be the way it's supposed to be, so there must not be a God. My response to him was, you just used the word supposed to. And that implies purpose. There's something within you that knows that there's purpose in man and in the world around him that's not being fulfilled. And if there's purpose, that implies creation. It implies creation. So I think we know this deep within us, that the world is not the way it's supposed to be, because we've departed from God. And if it's a purely materialistic world, then those yearnings of our heart wouldn't be there to begin with. We would be satisfied with whatever it is that's around us. We would just simply live life trying to avoid suffering. But people today are trying to avoid suffering left and right, and they're having major crises, falling into deeper anxieties, depressions, fears. Suicide levels just keep rising. We know there's something wrong, and we know that our heart is yearning for something greater than just what the material world around us can provide us. I think that's one of the greatest proofs for God there is. So, remember, in all of this, the goal is not to convince, but simply to plant a seed and to leave with a holy sense of discomfort. The goal is not to create a believer, in other words, but to leave a person open to the simple question, what if? That's really where we want to get somebody. Open to the question, what if? And get them thinking about it. And if that opening is created, what do we do with it? And that comes to the final part. What cuts through all objections is not a rational argument, but beauty and relationship. These are the things that break through. So what we need to do when talking with an atheist is to present not just a logical, but more importantly, a beautiful alternative. To explain the beautiful vision of Orthodox Christianity for God, for man, and for their relationship. Why we believe things are so broken and how we believe healing occurs. And how we've seen it occur in beautiful ways. You know what convinces most people? There's so many people in this church who were convinced of the existence of God because they walked into the church. That was it. They walked into the church during a service and they saw and heard and smelled beauty. And they immediately went, that part of their heart that's yearning for the transcendent woke up. And they said, there's something here that I can't find anywhere else. That's really what we want to present. So we have to be able to talk about the beauty of Christianity, the beauty of Christ, which means we have to know and love Christ ourselves, which is why the more you work on your spiritual life, the better at this you'll become. And then you can tell them your personal experiences. You know, as much as we want to be objective in all of this, the reality is that what really transforms people is stories. And if you can tell them about your personal experiences of faith, this is really transformative for them. What I mean by personal experiences is not necessarily lights and sounds and miracles and things like that. But talking about how your faith in Christ and your practices in the faith have healed your past traumas, or maybe spiritual transformations. These are really significant. Maybe you had addictions, or maybe you had spiritual wounds, or just things you couldn't get over. And then in finding Christ and in praying and fasting, you can't explain it, but somehow, some way, those things have healed. It's always an amazing thing to find somebody who lived their life in negativity and darkness for 30, 40, 50 years, and they found Christ, and within a couple years, their whole family says, you're a different person. What are you doing differently? Well, I go to church now. I fast and pray, and I read the scriptures, and that's it. There's obviously something more than just the material happening there, because they may have tried other faiths and other philosophies before, but there's something there that you do not need to explain, and I want to make sure you avoid that trap. You don't always need to explain. You can just say, I can't explain it, but this is what happened to me. This is what happened in my life. There's something significant there, but again, their heart needs to be open to it to begin with. That's everything we talked about already. And then finally, what do? You invite them. You may not be convinced. You seem to be thinking over these things. Why don't you come? No, I don't want to come. I've been to churches before. First of all, you probably have never been to a church like this. Second of all, we have people come every single Sunday who have never been to an Orthodox service before, or nearly every Sunday. No one cares. You can sit in the back and do nothing. But why don't you just come and see what I'm talking about, because I can't put it into words. Right? What does St. Paul talk about? I know a man in Christ, third heaven, who saw things which it would be unlawful for man to speak of. Why? Because you automatically soil the experience by trying to put it into human words. Human words will never express the beauty of it. So just come and experience it. And that's ultimately where we want to get people. But that may not happen after the first discussion. You may notice over time that they just slowly open up, and eventually you just pull them over the threshold. Just come and see. I want to end, I'm actually doing way better on time than I thought I was going to. I was kind of going fast because I was afraid this was going to be super long. So forgive me if I rushed over some things that maybe required more explanation. But I do want to end on one particular tactic that I actually don't think is very helpful. I want to talk about bringing up the subject of miracles. When somebody's heart is really shut off to all of this, bringing up miracles, as convincing as they are, is really, I found, not very effective. And I'll tell you that when a Christian has his or her faith depend on miracles, I always find that it's not a very strong basis for faith in the first place. And it can be a little shallow. If all it took were miracles, then we would broadcast our miracles left and right, and we would tell everyone about them, and essentially we'd all be fighting over who could tell everyone about the miracles, and the faith would constantly be talking about this. For us, you always hear me talk about saints as people who live with one foot on earth and one foot in heaven, so the miraculous for us becomes normal. We don't really make a big deal out of it. When I find Orthodox Christians who are always, every time they say, did you hear about this great miracle that happened here? Did you hear about this great miracle that happened here? I go, yeah. But for us, it's not a big deal because that's just normal life for us. And when we have a really strong Orthodox worldview, we recognize the miraculous in things that other people wouldn't see as miraculous. I always give this same example, that there is a church near Boston, where they've had, I think, 6 or 7 icons that at one time or another have streamed myrrh or wept. And when you go into the church, one in particular does it almost every feast of the Theotokos that there is. But when you go in, you can't pick out which icon it is. And I asked the priest once, I said, why don't you have that icon sectioned out somewhere else and, very elaborate and everything? And he said, because all icons are miraculous. That's an Orthodox ethos. That's the mindset. But for us, every single icon makes present the figure who's depicted, and so it's miraculous. And some are made miraculous in a way that is much more present and physical and visual for us, and some less so. Father Josiah Trenham gives the example of Elisha, the prophet Elisha in the axe head. You know that story? A man had borrowed his neighbor's axe, and while he was using it, the head came off and sunk into the river. And the prophet comes over and prays, and it suddenly floats to the top. And Father Josiah rightly notes, he says, God was just as present in the sinking of the axe head as he was in the floating of it. This is kind of an Orthodox ethos. So I'm not saying that talking about miracles is necessarily wrong in and of itself. But I'll tell you that non-believers, it doesn't matter how strong of a proof you give, they're going to dismiss them. they'll dismiss him outright. There needs to be a little opening before you even talk about those things. There have been people who have had it, especially when they come into Orthodoxy from like Protestantism or other places where they don't see the presence of miracles so often and the ideas of the saints, and they're a little bit unsettled by them because they're not used to them. I have given them books. The book I mainly give them is the life of Saints Raphael and Nicholas and Irene. And if you don't know their story, in the 1950s, on the island of Lesbos, I believe, in Greece, these martyrs had been martyred hundreds of years prior. But they started appearing to multiple people in dreams and waking visions and describing how they were martyred and telling them where to find their relics. And so they're known as kind of modern saints, even though they're not really historically modern. They're modern to the Orthodox Church because they were forgotten for hundreds of years. And they appeared to all these people, and these people went to Photius Contiglu, this great iconographer, and they explained what they looked like, and they made the icon. He made the icon of them based on their descriptions, and now we all know about them. We had some of their relics in seminary, and sometimes they'd stream myrrh. So I've given that book to some people, and after that they were like, well, I have no objections. They're like there's nothing you can say in the face of evidence like this. But the reality is that while miracles and the miraculous can be part of a personal story, they really can't be the foundation. And until you've opened up that heart a little bit, I wouldn't really start there. I don't think it's the best place to start, because when people's hearts are really shut off, what they do is then they, instead of dealing with it in a rational way, they start to just say, well, now your faith just looks like superstition to me. And they use it as a way to object it without actually having to engage it. So there's a place for the miraculous, but not at the beginning of conversations with atheists. So that's something I would avoid. Okay, I ran through that in 57 minutes. I'm kind of shocked because I had a lot of pages here. I had, I had 10 pages of notes here, and so I rushed, thinking that it was going to take like over an hour and a half, and I didn't want to do that to you. So we'll just open it up to questions.
Is used to, without really addressing the argument, to sort of undercut the fact that you're arguing at all.
Okay. So the question is, if I can restate that, I don't know if I can. Basically, how do we respond to people who say when you bring up that good and evil, that consciousness, that all these things cannot be explained by the material world, they must be explained by God, that they then say that, well, you're just using God to fill in gaps of knowledge that we don't have, and so your God is not really a positive one, but one simply to fill in the areas that you're uncomfortable not knowing about.
Correct.
Okay, so right off the bat, the first thing I would say is that, well, can't you say the exact same thing about any science? And I mean, like, is there any area of knowledge in academia where we can't say the same thing? Every time you come up with an explanation, you go, well, you're just coming up with an explanation because it just fits a gap that you're uncomfortable with. Well, of course, I mean, that's just nature of mankind. We're uncomfortable with gaps, and we fill it with these ideas. And I hate to tell them, but there's a lot of areas of science where you have to do that in ways that you fill it with the strongest theory available. And that's how we live, and then we go based off of that because it becomes the only one available. So until you come up with, my first response is, until you come up with a better explanation, you're criticizing me from a point of nothingness. You have no positive criticism of my explanation. The second thing I would say is that indeed, if my arguments against you were the only thing I based my faith on, I think you would have some legitimacy there. But I actually have all this other stuff that I can talk about in my own personal experiences. And again, there's a lot more to this. We could talk about this on and on and on and on. There's a lot of positive reasons for belief in God, but you're not even open to those because you're still stuck in these other areas. And I'm showing you that the areas that you're stuck in don't work without God in the first place. So all we're doing is talking about the foundational stuff, and there's much more to build on. Actually, one of my favorite things to talk, I know I said don't focus on the miraculous too much, but I love to bring up the examples of 2,000 years of saints. Do you know why? It's not, somebody can say, oh, it's 2,000 years of people making these figures up, and I would say, okay, that's fine. Show me, in 2,000 years, show me all the accounts of people who went to meet these saints and said, everything I've read about them is not true, they're nothing like that at all. Because wouldn't you expect to find that? Books about St. Porphyrios were being written while he was still alive. St. Anthony, the whole entire Roman Empire knew his name and was running out into the desert. You cannot find a single account of someone who went out and met him and said, oh my gosh, everything that we've heard is a lie. This guy is not anything special. There's nothing miraculous happening here. People gave up their entire lives as witnesses of these things because they saw the results of faith and a life with God right before them. And you cannot find a single account of somebody saying, that's not true. I knew the guy. So again, there's a lot of other arguments that we could make, and there's a lot of other positive reasons to believe in this, but these are foundational things that somebody is saying, well, all you're doing is I'm filling in with the only explanation so far, and until you come up with a better alternative, the only reason you reject it is because you don't really care about the evidence. You're stuck. You're stuck on not believing in God, and so you're rejecting it without ever actually really considering it.
Worth pointing out, I've only heard this when the conversation became hostile because I wasn't the person to be talking to them about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that what it is, that is what I call a throwaway argument, in the sense that the person is simply saying, well, you've painted me into a corner, and because God is the only explanation for what you've given me, I'm now going to throw away God because I don't like that he's the only explanation, and now I'm going to make it about your emotional state and the fact that that's the only answer you're comfortable with. Well, you didn't actually deal with the argument. Yes?
This is a version of the problem of evil, but I've heard some people argue, well, how could God be good if he created the devil to begin with? And so it ends up kind of going into the realm of like, I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah. Yeah, how can we believe in a good God who created the devil to begin with? Well, I mean, the theological answer is that God created an angel, and the angel rebelled against God and became the devil. And then you can sit there and say, well, then why would God create something if he knew that it would go against him? And again, the response is, well, why would God only create things that he knew would be obedient to him? Is he then really created with us with free will? And this gets into theological areas that are beyond the human comprehension. And so before we can even talk about those things, let's talk about who Jesus Christ is. And I think that's really important, by the way. That's another thing I didn't really mention tonight, and I probably should have. Don't get bogged down into deep theological stuff without first talking about the basics of who Christ is and what he did for us. You know, I made that mistake when I was like in college and like I wasn't newly Orthodox. I had been brought into the church many years before, but intellectually and spiritually, I was really embracing the faith. And so someone would say, hey, what is orthodoxy? And I'd say, let me tell you about hesychism. It's probably not the best place to start. That was kind of foolish. Yes, Molly?
So you mentioned the Socratic Method, and I'm wondering, like, how do you give someone a brief synopsis of who Jesus is? Because that seems kind of like a daunting task. And how do you do it in a way that's not just, here, let me give you a 3-minute advertisement for my Savior? Like, you know, how do you do it in a more Socratic way that helps them to realize it on their own?
So the answer is how do you present Christ in a way that goes in line with the Socratic method rather than just giving an advertisement for the faith? I'm repeating it for the recording. It really depends on what they're saying to begin with, because you can't engage in the Socratic method until you found out what their presuppositions are to begin with. But I do think it's important. There's another point you made that may not be actually what you're asking, but I think it's important to point out, and that's that we can't do bumper sticker Christianity. One of the things I like to say is that if your worldview can fit in a bumper sticker, it's not very deep to begin with. And a lot of people try to do this, where they try to give like the tagline and say this is the be-all and end-all, and it really doesn't work that way. And that's why you have to get to know them first. and find out where are their struggles, what are the things that they're really anguishing over. And then we can talk about Christ in those terms. But do we have a basic, I wouldn't call it bumper sticker, but do we have a basic summary of what we believe? Yeah, we have the creed. But then we have to go in and explain what those things actually mean. And what do you focus on? That's going to depend on the person. And that's where the Socratic method is helpful, because wherever those presuppositions are that they have, we can say, oh, we actually have, this is where that underlying belief is broken, and this is actually where it fills in. But you have to really get to know them in that. So it's hard to answer that one because there is no general answer for it. It really depends on where they are. I'll also say that I do agree that sometimes when people end up talking about Christ, it becomes into like an eye roll moment, and that's why I think we have to give a little bit of a deeper explanation. And the way that I personally do this is I always begin with the brokenness of humanity. I start with something that everyone can kind of relate to. We talked, I think, in the first or second lecture about some people who like to just walk up and say, have you ever stolen something? Yes. Well, then you're a thief, and you need a savior. I don't know that that's really the way to go. I think the Orthodox medicinal model, the hospital model, the therapeutic model is much better. And saying this is where we have brokenness. And the reality is that human beings do yearn for something that's transcendent and infinite, and that can only be found in God, but sin creates a wall between man and God. So how can that be fixed unless someone brought them together? And in the person of Christ, you have a full man and a full divine being in one. And so this is our job, is to seek to the one who has overcome that gap and shows us that way. And we have 2,000 years of people who have done so, and they seem to say that the life is worthwhile. And we have proofs in front of us. I find that, again, a little bit deeper than a bumper sticker. Here's 3 sentences about Jesus, believe in him or go to hell, which I don't find very helpful at all. Yes?
So, say you know somebody and you kind of know what their general story is, their kind of trauma and everything. How do you, and their gears are turning, how do you kind of promote those gears to keep on turning and everything?
So what if you know someone, you know their traumas, the wheels are turning, how do you
How do you keep them moving and not being so imposing and trying to be like...
how do you basically not be pushy about it and overbearing about it? Yeah. I can only tell you my method for this. My method is to tell them again about the beauty of the faith. Now, it depends on the personality again. If they're a reader, there may be a good book that you know is really going to touch them and answer a lot of their questions. That can be effective. But if they're not, there's a much more general thing you can do. I can tell you're struggling with these things, you're thinking about them, you're probably going to have a lot more questions. When you're ready, come to me. And in the meantime, if it's all right with you, I'm going to be praying for you. And just leave it. Because that leaves them with that holy sense of discomfort, but also a place to go when they're ready. And it keeps you from being pushy. Being pushy is not effective. Being pushy is a great way to get people who are interested to run the other way. And I've unfortunately seen that happen. People who get curious and they feel just spiritually pummeled, and they run. It's not a healthy. You got to just leave it. And that's why I say I mentioned earlier, some of the things that they say may seem offensive or may just seem really off. You don't need to address every single one of them. Sometimes you got to let it sit. And I've done that as well. I do that with people quite a bit actually when they come as inquirers, and I say, you know what? There's a few things that you said and a few opinions you have that I'm not so convinced of. I think there's a better answer for, but let's leave that for another time. I'd really rather focus on these more foundational things first. I do that with people all the time. And then I write myself little notes. When you meet with so-and-so, make sure you mention this, 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 and this. And you have to leave it for the right time. Mm-hmm.
How do you build the discernment to know to do that without messing people up by engaging with them?
Okay, how do you get the discernment to learn how to do that with people? What was the last part? Without scaring them off. We need to learn how to listen much better. We just really need to learn how to listen much better. Last night we had the men's group and I talked about our relationship with our wives, and I mentioned that for a long time I've been wanting to do, I haven't done it yet, but I want to do a marriage retreat, a 3-parter. One on what it means to be a man, Part 2, what it means to be a woman. I'll be really great at that one. I've been reading a lot. And Part 3 is just communications. And this is a communications class that I do with engaged couples, and I do it with couples who just need some marital counseling. Before I even talk about their issues, I always do a communications class. And the communications class is largely on how to really properly listen. And listen means asking the right questions too. And so when you learn how to do that and you really let the other person lead, you can, it's a strange thing, I can't really describe it, but you can lead somebody along a path while really only listening at the same time. You just have to know how to ask the right questions and guide it a little bit. And that's essentially what you're doing when you're talking with people who have objections, is you have to guide them a little bit, and only when the time is, and you'll notice when they're really ready for answers. And if you're not sure, you ask. You ask. But you can tell from their reactions pretty quickly whether you've pushed too far. It becomes pretty apparent really quickly. And over time, you do that less. But when you do it, you say, oh, you know what? Maybe I went too fast. Let's back up a little bit. You know, we're still talking about this. I thought we were over here. Let's talk about this. And you can just kind of back yourself up. But you need to learn to read people, which means you have to do this very humbly. You cannot be... Remember in Looney Tunes? These weren't like major characters, but remember there was like the big tough dog, and then there was a little yappy one that was always like, come on, here we go, you know, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Who are we going to beat up today? You know, whatever it is. Like, you can't be like that. You can't be like that and like so excited to go after them. You have to slow down. So, I mean, I just had today, I had a little over 2 hour, well, no, it was a 2-hour meeting with somebody. They brought a lot. I had to learn for the first hour and 15 minutes, basically, I barely said a word. And you just have to let them feel comfortable with you. And you'll notice them close up. Watch body language too. Body language will tell you a lot about if they start to close up. The body will tell you much more quickly than the words, and much more truthfully too. You know? Yeah, I'm totally comfortable talking to you. Yeah, no, you're not. No, you're not. I've had that happen actually quite a few times in pastoral encounters where people say things that their bodies are telling me aren't true. And so I know I got to back off in those areas. Okay, any last questions? Okay, thank you very much. I think our next talk is on talking with Protestants, I believe. Why is there a reaction to that one? It's either that or Roman Catholics. It's one or the other. But we will do that probably not in March, but after Lent. So may God bless and keep you. Thank you all for coming and for your questions.